Introduction. SEO, search engine optimization, is never a completely sure thing. If a company claims that it can guarantee to get you to the top spot in the SERPs, search engine results pages, for any given keyword, you should run a mile. They're blowing smoke. While this is true, however, what is also true is that some methods are more successful than others, and some are more of a sure thing than others. And in that regard, the SEO strategy that is perhaps the closest thing there is to a guaranteed route to success is split testing. Split testing essentially means taking a rigorous and somewhat scientific approach to your search engine optimization, which effectively means removing the guesswork from the process. In fact, what split testing really amounts to is helping your site to evolve to become the most optimized version of itself. How does all this work? It's actually very simple, although not without a great deal of nuance that can determine the success of such endeavors. When done well, split testing can mold any website or blog into a hugely successful titan that catapults every new post to the top of Google. When done incorrectly, split testing can jeopardize all your hard work and risk getting your site removed entirely. It's high risk, high reward, but it's also perfectly accepted by Google and a skill that's 100% worth developing. In this training, then, we're going to take a deep dive looking at the power of split testing for SEO. You'll discover how to use this strategy employing the most effective tools, how to avoid common mistakes, and how to use split testing in a host of other capacities too, such as to help sell a product or improve engagement with your audience. Once you master this skill, you'll be able to take your SEO activities to another level. What is split testing? Before we go any further, just what is split testing? And what does the term mean in the context of search engine optimization? Essentially, split testing means taking a product, marketing material, or anything else and creating two slightly different versions of it in order to see which one performs best. This is used by businesses all the time in the real world and helps them to make smarter decisions and to avoid wasted investments. Let's imagine for a moment that you own a chain of fast food restaurants that sell only prawn-based dishes, because why not? Your store has been doing fairly well, but then you hear somewhere that on average, takeaways with red and orange color schemes on their premises tend to earn more. Why? Because those colors increase the heart rate and make people slightly uncomfortable. Therefore, they are more likely to eat quickly and to leave the area, freeing up the table for the next customer. The result is that such venues actually see a higher turnover of customers and greater profits. This is just a random example, but it also happens to be true. The problem is that Prawns For You happens to use a blue color scheme in its interior design. What if you could increase your daily profits in all stores by coloring the store red? Problem is, this could just as well backfire. What if you hurt your brand recognition and thereby reduce your sales drastically? What if the lack of nautical color theme means that people feel less fishy? Whatever the case, you now have three choices. A, leave your stores as they are and leave potential profits on the table. B, change the color of your stores and hope that this doesn't hurt your ranking. C, run a split test. And of course, the last option is the one that will stand to serve you best. To perform this, you will now instruct 2 or 3 of your 50 stores to change the color of their interiors. You'll then monitor the progress of those stores for the next 6 months, and then collect all the data together to see what it can tell you. What you're looking for is a sign that the stores that were colored red, A, saw a spike in profits and turnover, B, outperformed the stores that did not change anything. If the change helped to boost your store's success, then you might choose to adopt the change and thereby roll it out across all your stores, potentially seeing a large spike in traffic. If the change hurt your store's success, then you simply change it back and then run the next experiment. The financial damage and the brand visibility will only be slightly impacted, so no harm done. If you had rolled the change out across all stores, then you would have potentially lost a lot of money and created confusion around your brand. And if the change did nothing, then you can basically choose how you want to proceed. This is the basic concept behind split testing, and it is something that companies have been using for decades. Split testing for SEO. How does this work in the world of SEO? Well, while we'll get into the specifics and the nitty-gritty of SEO in a moment, the main thing you need to know at this point is that Google relies on a few factors when determining how prominently to feature a website in the SERPs. For example, Google will look for the presence of keywords. It will look for the use of H1 and H2 tags, large, bold text. It will look for images that have certain alt tags and file names, and it will look for signals from users, such as the amount of time spent on the page. The problem is that no one knows the specifics of the algorithm. We know that Google likes sites that use keywords subtly, and our best guess is that the ideal keyword density is about 1 to 3%, meaning that the keyword appears 1 to 3 times in each 100 words. But we don't know precisely how many times Google wants us to repeat the phrase. We don't know where the tipping point is, where it becomes too much. We don't know how much Google wants to see us use related terms, and we're not 100% sure whether it's better to focus on just one keyword or to try a few. Again, everyone has their opinions. This makes it very hard to make smart decisions as a site owner. Do you include more keywords in your articles or not? Should you use that image before the text or after it? And is it a good idea to use H1 tags, or are you better off with H2 tags? The answer is that we just don't know. And for that reason, the best option is to run A/B tests, the other term for split tests, in order to see which changes positively affect your search ranking and which do not. Why we need split testing now more than ever, the powerful benefits of this strategy. So, why do we need split testing in the SEO community now more than ever? The simple answer is that SEO is more complex than it has ever been, and we have even less idea of how it works. For a moment, let me talk about another tangentially related example. YouTube's copyright algorithm. You see, over on YouTube, there is an algorithm designed to ensure that users don't upload copyrighted content. This prevents YouTube from getting into legal trouble and protects the intellectual property of music labels and movie studios. In theory, anyway. The problem is that this copyright detection can be a little gung-ho and will sometimes pick out the background music at a party and use that to file a copyright strike against the person who uploaded the video. Most people would agree that's a little unfair. That's why some creators decided to test precisely how the system works. They did this by uploading hundreds of versions of the same song, versions that had been modulated up or down a semitone, versions that had been transposed down an octave, versions played background, versions played quietly, versions played only for short clips. Doing all of this allowed them to test the limits of the system and then to provide the wider community with useful rules on how to avoid being penalized. They discovered that if less than 10 seconds of content matched, then the person who uploaded the video would likely be fine. And this allowed for a whole host of fair use practices. SEO is just the same. Google is constantly changing its algorithms, moving the goalposts, and going back on what it has said. One minute, it's a good idea to get as many links as possible. The next moment, that's the worst thing you can do. Right now, Google is making a big push toward a more AI-driven service. It wants the user to speak to Google using natural language and to receive carefully curated responses drawn from the web. That is far more complex than simply looking for exact keyword matches, and it makes our job as SEOs that much harder. That's why using A/B tests to identify precisely what works and what doesn't is such an important move. Then there's the fact that this is so multivariate. For example, it might be that Google would prefer you to use a number of headers in your content with keywords in a perfect world. But what happens if you then add those headers in, only to find that this actually drives away your visitors? That alone is useful information you could garner from a split test. But it's also possible that in driving away visitors, you send negative signals to Google and end up hurting your ranking. Even though what you're doing is considered good from an SEO standpoint, it is working contrary to another system within the ranking algorithm. When you take all of that into account, it becomes less obvious what you should do, and this makes it all the more useful to just test it and see what actually works. This is useful if you are a business looking to climb the ranks of Google without shooting yourself in the foot. It's useful if you are starting out and want to adopt the very best strategy from the very start. And what's more, this is extremely important if you're an SEO specialist or agency selling your services to a client. At a time when nothing is certain in the world of SEO, explaining to a customer why you think they should adopt a certain strategy or employ a particular technique is difficult. But if you can show clearly that the strategy works in a controlled and safe environment, then you can increase your chances significantly of securing their business. Why split testing is the perfect business strategy. In many ways, split testing is the perfect business strategy. If that sounds hyperbolic, then hear me out for a moment. How can any business strategy truly be perfect, you ask? The answer is that when employed correctly, Split testing will literally evolve your site to the point where it thrives, avoiding all the bad mistakes that you might have otherwise made along the way. So, let's say you start out with a fairly average site that is performing very averagely in the SERPs. Using split testing, you might decide to start using more H1 tags with keywords in, or you might choose to start using images a little more. This causes a bump in your position. You then decide to test some design changes to your site. Doing so convinces you that you should be using a slightly less busy and more modern layout. You therefore switch to a new theme for your WordPress site that looks great. Bit by bit, you adopt more decisions to help to hone your site into the perfectly optimized design for Google, and slowly but surely, it climbs the ranks. You can't make a bad decision because you see those mistakes coming a mile off. And if you keep tweaking, you keep on improving. In this way, split testing is the best way to evolve your site and is the closest thing to a perfect strategy there is. Why split testing works and when it doesn't, understanding statistical significance. You might at this point be asking why you should go to all the trouble of creating a split test when you could just run a short trial period instead. Why color 3 prawn shops red and then wait for them to collect enough actionable data? Isn't this really just a fancy way of describing a kind of public beta test? Well, there are a few key differences to keep in mind, which involve thinking like an actual scientist, because that's what this is emulating. FYI, this is precisely the same technique used in research. When a researcher wants to know if a particular drug will help to boost someone's alertness, they find out by creating 2 separate groups, an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is the one that receives the drug, and the control group is the one that doesn't. This then gives the researcher the opportunity to compare the stats from the 2 groups. What this achieves is to remove confounding variables. A confounding variable is anything that can hurt your outcome, rendering the results of the study useless. For example, if you also introduce a new exercise program to the individual taking the drug, then it might be this that makes them more focused, rather than the drug. That skews your results, and you therefore don't know whether the drug or the intervention made the difference. One of the most common confounding variables in research is the placebo effect. This effect describes the fact that when you tell someone they're receiving a drug, they will then feel better even if the drug is just a sugar pill. The power of belief is so strong that this can end up skewing the results as the subject optimism and belief helps them to dig deeper and find more focus. That's why the experimental group will often receive a sugar pill. This way, both groups think they are getting something, and you can thereby rule out the role of placebo in the study. So back to your SEO. What does all this have to do with split testing? Well, essentially, you have your experimental group and your control group. The experimental group is the one where you have introduced a new header or whatever else, and the control group is the one where you have left everything as it was. The reason this is so important is that the 2 pages are exactly the same and are being tested at the same time, under the same conditions. If you changed the page only for a short time and then changed it back, you wouldn't be able to account for confounding variables such as naturally peaking and waning interest, or such as global events that might impact on internet usage habits. In other words, it may be that as soon as you change to a different web design, a competitor launched their site and took all of your visitors. The drop in traffic had nothing to do with your new web design, but you might not know this. As such, the experiment is void, and you end up acting on false data. Likewise, if you were to simply adopt some changes in your next article, you couldn't know for certain that any boost or drop in performance wasn't simply due to the content of that article being better or worse. Split testing is the only way to be certain that you have controlled for as many variables as possible. When split testing goes wrong, so a split test is absolutely impervious to error, right? Wrong. Anyone who has done a science or math degree will already know what the problem with this strategy is: the sample size. Going back to the lab for a moment, a sample size refers to the number of subjects who take part in the study. Because if you have one person take the sugar pill and one person take the real drug, then you can't be certain that the person taking the real drug didn't also happen to get over a cold that same day. It looks as though they saw a boost in performance, but in fact it was just coincidence. The same thing goes for running split tests for SEO. If you have 2 versions of a website and one enjoys a bigger boost in SEO than the other, then this could potentially be a result of one page having lower bounce rates than the other. That means that people didn't spend long on one version of the page, which in turn impacted on the page being demoted in the SERPs. But what if the reason that the one page had higher bounce rates was simply that it was lucky? that the people who went there happened to be in less of a hurry. If you only ran the experiment for one day and you had 10 people go to each site, then it's statistically unlikely that all the people on one of the pages just so happened to be in a hurry, but it's not impossible. And this is where the idea of statistical significance comes in. In order to rule out freak coincidence and chance, you need a large enough sample size. You can never say with 100% certainty that the results of your test are accurate, but you can run the test long enough and get enough subjects to say that it is accurate beyond reasonable doubt. You might flip a coin and get heads 10 times in a row. That's an extremely unlikely outcome, but it's possible. But if you flip a coin and get heads 100 times in a row, that is so astronomically unlikely to be coincidence that you can probably assume the coin is rigged. The same goes for your split test. Run the test long enough and the results become increasingly likely to be accurate. This is what we refer to as statistical significance. You can actually run tests to find out if your results are significant, which will give you a p-value. This p-value tells you the percentage likelihood that the outcome was a fluke, with anything less than 5%, p greater than 0.05, being considered significant. But for now, the main take-home is that you should make sure you run your test long enough, don't draw premature conclusions, and never assume that the outcome is 100% guaranteed to be accurate. If you want to be extremely scientific about this, then you can always run what is known as a chi-squared test. This is a test of significance, which is a calculation that takes numbers, crunches them, and provides a p-value. You can use the number of impressions on each page in order to do this, or the page ranking over a given amount of time. Nothing is certain. Another thing to keep in mind is that SEO strategies change. What was a great SEO strategy once can change on a dime once Google decides to change its mind. If you're comparing two different pages for their SEO positioning then, keep in mind that what works now might not work in the future. That's why it's important that you keep on testing and experimenting, and always be cautious when adopting new strategies wholesale. Using split testing for SEO success. The practical guide. Okay, that's enough theory for a bit. It's time to get practical. How do you go about running a split test and seeing how it impacts on your SEO? There are a couple of different ways. In this video, we're going to look at two of the most common, creating two different versions of a web page versus creating one page that loads differently for different users. We'll look at how this works and at which one is best for you. In this video, we will first of all discuss the most common method, which is to use different pages on the same website. Two different web pages. The first option is to compare two slightly different web pages that employ different SEO strategies, keeping everything else as close to equal as possible. More accurately, you will compare two groups of different pages. Comparing two versions of the same page can work, but it's rife with difficulty. Let's say, for example, that you have a web page all about how to train your Labrador and a web page all about how to train your Golden Retriever. These pages are almost identical in subject matter, and you're going to go out of your way to ensure they are extremely similar in all other ways that count, too. You'll ensure they have the same number of links pointing to them, that they are equally prominent on your site, that they are the same length, that they have the same number of headings, etc. From here, you can then go about making small changes to a few of the matched pages and see if this boosts or hurts traffic. You'll then watch the difference in your stats, making sure to collect as much data as possible. Repeat this a few times with different matched pages, and once you are sure that your new SEO strategy works, introduce it to the rest of your content. Challenges. Of course, this option is not perfect. In case you hadn't already figured it out, one big issue is that both versions of the page are targeting different keywords or competing for the same ones, which massively skews your results. Different keywords will include different competition, different related terms, and more. All of this means that you are never comparing like for like. And if you try and create two pages that compete for the same keyword, then you could end up running afoul of one of Google's most recent algorithm updates, the diversity update. This update is aimed at ensuring that most SERPs don't display multiple results for the same site, thereby meaning that you won't have a fair fight on your hands. You can create two pages targeting the same keywords and see which one wins, but even then, you are changing the results simply by having competition exist provided by you. You could always create two pages the exact same, but this is inadvisable for a number of reasons. Firstly, Google will see a precise duplicate page as being worthless and might even penalize the page. Google doesn't want its users to repeatedly stumble upon the same content, and so it won't rank it. If these pages are hosted on separate domains, which introduces more complex factors such as domain age, then Google might see one page as having violated the copyright of the other, and the entire site could be severely penalized. Then there's the fact that having more than one page with the same content is confusing for viewers and could lose you the trust of your readers. The optimal answer to this is to use different pages, but to make sure that you target extremely similar keywords. Use a keyword research tool like KW Finder, www.kwfinder.com, and then target keywords that have similar search volumes and similar KD, keyword difficulty ratings. When you do this, you can try different techniques on similar pages with similar objectives and see which one comes out on top. Another option is to look at two pages that rank identically, and then try making the change to one of those pages and see how it is affected. This is a slightly better strategy because you are starting from a similar place. What's more is that you can open up your stats and then use the historical data in order to make a forecast of how the web pages should have behaved. If one page was moving in a certain direction and that direction sped up, slowed down, or reversed, then it might be the result of the changes you made, especially if the matched page did not show the same changes. Again, the different difficulty of different keywords, the amount of competition, etc., can all impact on your results and potentially skew your findings. But while this might be seen as a problem, it can be mitigated somewhat by simply using as many pages as possible in your test. In other words, instead of taking two similar web pages and comparing their success where one has been changed, you instead take two groups of pages and make the changes to some of them while leaving the others as they are. Again, it's possible that by sheer coincidence, multiple pages will perform better than others beginning from that point. But that's when you use the statistical significance tests, compared the new and the old ranking positions of those in Group A to those in Group B, and then find out if the data suggests an effect. This is the main technique that this training will be recommending for carrying out split tests, and we'll call it the matched pages method, the technical bit, using redirects. As mentioned, the big problem with the method described in the previous video is that it doesn't allow you to control for every single confounding variable. While you might run lots of tests with very similar pages, they are still different pages, and they might still succeed or fail based on other factors. While you can use larger groups to minimize this effect, it's still ultimately going to mean basing your decisions on estimated guesses. And there are limits to just how many pages you can use in a split A/B test. If you're going to be changing the results across hundreds of pages on your site, then this will involve a lot of work. What's more is that you will be potentially hurting your site in a big way if the change proves to be a mistake. The whole point of A/B testing is to conduct the experiment in a controlled manner. So what can you do? One answer is to use a redirect, which has different and unique pros and cons. A redirect simply means that you're going to send visitors to a different version of the website. This will use a number of different methods, more in a moment, but one of the simplest is the HTML redirect. The browser will read this code and will then follow it to the new page. If you use this method, then as soon as a visitor lands on a web page, there will be a short pause and then they will be sent to the new web page. Of course, this version of a split test also has its limitations. After all, there's no way for Google to alter its ranking depending on which page performs best. That's because the two versions of the page are one and the same as far as Google is concerned, meaning that they will only rank once depending on which version Google took into account. So how can this be used to monitor your SEO performance? This is useful for measuring a host of factors that will impact on your SEO. That means things like bounce rates, things like CTR, click-through rate, and more. While this might not directly affect your ranking, seeing what page design or content is best for audience retention will have a big effect on your ranking, so this can be just as useful. Which type should you use? The answer is, of course, both, if you have the time. The more data you collect, the smarter decisions your business will make, and the more likely you are to see performance boosts. Better redirects. The redirect used above will work as described to send a user directly to a different website. This way, they can experience a temporary alternative to your main page without hurting the appearance of that page. Of course, what we really want to do, though, is to ensure that the page only loads for half of the visitors. That's where we need to get a little savvier. What's more is that we want Google to get sent to the new page as well. As it is, 100% of our visitors are being sent to the new page, and Google spiders will recognize that the page is a redirect and not a regular page. So why would it rank as normal? Instead, you'd be better off using a PHP redirect. PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. And yes, that means that it has its own name in the acronym, which is extremely confusing. PHP is a form of scripting language that runs on the server rather than in the browser. Your website is stored on a server somewhere, which is essentially a large computer, and the HTML code is then sent to and interpreted by a browser each time someone types in the correct URL. Because PHP runs on the server, that means that it runs before the browser ever sees it. In turn, that means that the page will appear in the browser fully formed. You can redirect in PHP by creating a PHP file with the name of your page and then inserting the following text. This will now redirect visitors to the new location, and it will do so in a way that is impossible for anyone to detect. Even if they were to view source, the source they'd see would be the HTML for the new page. The next thing we need to do is to ensure that only half of the visitors are sent to the new page, and we can do this by randomly redirecting those visitors. What this does is to choose a random number between 1 and 2, and if the number is 1, then it sends the visitor to the new page. If not, they stay where they are. This works by using a timer to choose the number, hence the need for the micro-time part. You don't really need to know how this works though, only that it does work. Using include. While this method of redirecting visitors can be effective, it still isn't quite perfect. You still have two different types of web pages, which could potentially confuse results. The URL in the address bar will be different, for example, which could result in action from Google, more on this in a bit, and which could confuse your users. Another option then is to use an include file. This basically means that the page will populate itself with content from another page, allowing a blank template to become your new version of the page. In this version, you will create two HTML pages that only contain the elements that are different. This works particularly well if you are changing something about the text, for instance. Save these as version 1.htm and version 2.html. Then use the following code on the main page. Place this where on your page you want the difference to show. Of course, this becomes a little harder to track, and it won't be suitable for every single option. But you can always create two full-page include files and have them load instead. Finally, you can also include what is known as a 301 direct, which you'll achieve by using your htaccess file available through your file manager. Just open it up and add the line. As you can see, there are plenty of options, but by understanding how redirects work and how to use them if you should decide to, you'll be able to employ the full range of strategies. More use for redirects. There are more ways that redirects can be useful and more reasons that you should familiarize yourself with the technique. For example, this is also by far the most useful option for measuring other metrics, such as your conversions and your profits if you have a sales page, for example. In other words, if it's not ranking that you're testing for, then you can happily use the redirect method and then see whether this impacts on the way that users engage with your site. We'll talk more about this later in the training. Redirects using the include method can also be a better way to run the matched pages test. Rather than manually change half of the pages on your site, or a large bunch of pages in your experimental group, you can use the include file in order to make the change once and then insert it into half the pages on your site. That in turn means you'll be able to quickly reverse your efforts as well, or even run entirely new tests by changing text in just one document. Finally, a redirect can be a useful way of testing changes using the previous method, but without permanently altering your site.